So being the CEO of the Next Education has a lot of benefits, but I happened to get here pretty much by accident. And I say that because 2 decades ago, intelligent transportation and autonomy was not something that you heard as you do every day on TV here. It wasn't a discussion at the dinner table. But I was in technology, and what I always knew was that I love technology and I love people. And so one day I was fortunate enough to be put on a project where we had a vehicle that was talking to infrastructure, a vehicle that was talking to something. So we took communication and software and sensors, and we started making it send notes to things such as a phone or things such as an email. So we call that today V2X technology, which is vehicles talking to something. And the reason I mention that story is because years ago, we had no idea how big this industry was going to be, and we had no idea what was going to be possible. And now we call the larger industry Intelligent Transportation Systems, or ITS. And with ITS, it includes lots of things. It includes software, it includes hardware, it includes communication. And so you'll hear me today talk a lot about ITS when we're talking about the future of mobility. I want to talk a little bit about a real-world example of that before we get into the rest of the presentation. So many of you have likely been driving somewhere to a concert or to a doctor's appointment, and you really want to get there, but you stop at a light, and the light happens to be red, but there's nobody else that's coming. How frustrating. A lot of times I sit there and I go, it's 2 a.m, or it's 1 p.m, why can't I just go? Well, that light may not be connected, or likely is not. And an intelligent transportation system would allow that traffic signal to know that I was the only one that was at that light, and that there was no danger in the area because other people and other things weren't around me. And that's an example of intelligent transportation systems. And at the Next Education, we commit everything to training and educating our future on what intelligent transportation systems are and how they include both technology as well as people to make this work. The last thing I want to mention before I turn it over to Regina is I want to talk about new mobility. Many of you that are watching today know that transportation has changed and that the way we get around now is quite different. And so if you think about the word new mobility, it's around how you get things from point A to point B. And because we have so many more options than we had in the past, we need people to be able to support the growth of this new industry and to support the growth of new mobility so that we can have more accessibility, so that it can be more personalized, and so more people can be involved in making getting from point A to point B an easier job for them and more efficient. And today with me is Regina Hopper. She's going to share a little bit about herself, and she's just as passionate about this industry as I am. So Regina, can you share?
Thanks, Elaina. Hi, everybody. It's so great to see all of you. And at the end of this, what we're hoping that you will do is want to be a part of what we call intelligent transportation and new mobility systems. You know, I live right outside of the Washington, D.C. area, and many years ago, I'm not going to tell you how many, but I can tell you it's in decades, I had the opportunity to marry a law degree with a political science degree and work for CBS News in Washington, D.C., and have the opportunity to cover 2 presidents. And from there, moved into public policy. And in all of the years that I've been able to work in DC, I've been able to look at industries that used to live in silos, the transportation trucking industry, the media industry, the telecommunications industry, the energy industry, in particular with energy development and what fossil fuel development versus electric generation and electric vehicles can do for sustainability, and then back into intelligent transportation. And what's so fascinating about this field is that when it comes to intelligent transportation and new mobility systems, all of those different industries come together. And the reason that I'm so passionate and that I know Elaina's so passionate about this is because transportation affects every portion of our lives. We have to be able to get somewhere. We have to have our families and loved ones get to us. We have to be able to get goods and services. And surely we know, and we're going to talk about a little bit more here in just a few minutes, how important it has been for the logistical and transportation elements to work in a national and, of course, a worldwide emergency. So the intelligent transportation industry has become very important to all of us without all of us even those within the industry, even really understanding all of those different industry verticals that have come together. But the most important thing is that intelligent transportation has a purpose. Its purpose is to make life easier and to make life better. And we're going to be talking about 4 components in just a minute: accessibility, equity, safety, and sustainability, and how all of those 4 pillars are actually sustained by intelligent transportation. So I know that you're ready to move into the actual presentation itself, but throughout this presentation, think about 2 things and putting those 2 things together. Transportation, in particular, intelligent transportation, really does marry purpose and people. The purpose is to move people safely, equitably, in a sustainable way, in an accessible way. And it allows people then to have greater opportunities in their lives, no matter their age, no matter their demographics, no matter where they might be in the world. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Elaina, talk a little bit about who are these workers that are needed in this field? What is the data telling us? And then I'll look a little bit about the different various elements that make up intelligent transportation. Elaina?
So when we talk about purpose, we're going to talk a little bit about the data, and we're also going to talk about the purpose. And just as Regina said, intelligent transportation and new mobility is all based on purpose. The development and the deployment of these systems, they require looking at the workforce in a different way. So if you heard the example that I used earlier, and you also listened to what Regina said about all the industries that are involved, think about how difficult that is, because in the past, a lot of times there would be, I'm going to focus my efforts on being, as Regina said, an attorney, or I'm going to focus my efforts on being an IT or a computer scientist. But now, when you bring intelligent transportation and mobility onto the scene, it's no longer one or the other, it's one and the other. So when we talk about the workforce, we have workers that need to know mechanical engineering. We need a lot of engineers in this space. We need to have technicians that also understand how to, in the past, they may have been installing traffic signals, but in a very, we say, analog capacity. So maybe not as connected or communicating with other systems. And so our technicians and installers need to have a baseline understanding and need to have an education around very technical and digital mindsets. We also need leaders in this space that understand the policy behind autonomy and self-driving, as well as many of the, again, engineering avenues. We need more and more of those. Now let's talk about some of the numbers. So one of the articles that I read from the Brookings Institute just recently said there'll be over 9 million jobs that are opening up in self-driving and new mobility. And the World Economic Forum report in 2018 said by the year 2022 that there's going to be no less than 54% of all of the employees that are working today will need reskilling and upskilling. So that's exciting, and that's not scary. And here's why. Because if you think about all the new things that are coming out there, if you want to make a change and you want to be purposeful in moving goods and services and people and having accessibility, You'll want to know the latest and the greatest on policy. You'll want to know the latest and the greatest in technology. And that lifelong learning cycle will never be too far ahead because we need to skill our workers every day. Regina, can you talk a little bit more to the data and what we know?
So it's interesting, we call it data, but what does this data really tell us about how we get there? Well, it tells us that the only way that we're going to get there is to work together and to be willing to be empathetic with regard to looking at how others see transportation and how others who technically haven't seen themselves as transportation understand what it is we're trying to do collectively. Let me tell you a story. I was talking with the woman who is in charge of workforce development for the Department of Transportation in Colorado. And Colorado happens to be one of those states, the Colorado DOT is very far advanced. They have done amazing things in the state of Colorado, as has their sister state of Utah. And so after I spoke with the woman in Colorado, I picked up the phone and called another woman, again, in charge of her workers in the state of Utah. And again, one other state that's very far along in intelligent transportation. As a matter of fact, in the state of Utah, when they develop new roads, either when they are building new road infrastructure or if they are upgrading the infrastructure that they already have, they lay fiber underneath that infrastructure. Much of that fiber is dark fiber, but they are planning for the future to make sure that that infrastructure, in other words, those roads and anything that's built on those roads, signage, et cetera, are able then to talk with the car is able to talk with the infrastructure, and then people are actually able to use that data. So both of these women were telling me that the one thing that was hindering the development of intelligent transportation and new mobility services, both in Colorado and in Utah, was that the technology side of, in other words, the people who operate the computers, who operate the software, don't know how to talk to the transportation side. In other words, the people who work on the roads, the people who are doing planning, whether it be regional planning or statewide planning, or even regional planning with regard to the entire desert Southwest. So she said they went for a course of days where the technology side of the DOTs would tell them that they cannot get this done because it's not possible, to the transportation side saying that they don't understand because it's very simple. So she went up, walked down the hall and sat down and said, "What's the problem?" He said, "Tell me what it is you really want to do." When she explained it in English to him, he said, "Oh, you want to do that? Well, that's simple." It's a really good example of how technologists sometimes don't talk to transportation people. Transportation people sometimes don't know how to talk with technology people. And then you put communications people, in other words, the communications infrastructure in the middle of that. And you've got this sort of mumbo jumbo of people trying to talk to one another. So what the data tells us, the human data tells us, is that people need to learn and be empathetic with what their counterparts in these other industries are actually doing. Another thing that's really important from the data, 85% of CEOs tell us that in the new mobility and intelligent transportation arenas, that their workforce is going to have to be upskilled. That almost 80% of their workforce is going to have to be upskilled. And 80% of those people right now who need to be upskilled are getting their information from trade shows. And we all know that trade shows are great and wonderful things, but at trade shows, you're basically there to sell a product, or they're getting their information simply from conferences. And so what we know from the data is that there needs to be a very good, sufficient way in which to, consistent way in which to give people in all of these different industry verticals the information that they need to be able to learn. And, you know, I don't know the demographic age-wise of who we're speaking with right now, but if you remember the term Betamax, the thing that DOTs are most concerned about, especially DOT heads, they're pouring money, a lot of money, into intelligent infrastructure. And what they don't want to do is to have bought Betamax. They want to make sure that they understand the technology, that those who are going to be working with the technology understand it, and that technology will have a shelf life upon which you can build upon. And so That is why it's so important that the promises of intelligent transportation can only be delivered if people begin to work together. Going to the next slide, we talked about this a minute ago, but transportation connected to technology is really the definition of intelligent transportation. And these four things that we referred to earlier, accessibility, equity, safety, and sustainability, are truly the foundational elements of intelligent transportation. It's the purpose. It's marrying the purpose and the people. Accessibility really means both geographic accessibility as well as the financial accessibility to be able to get the transportation that you need to get to your job, to make a living, to see your family. Even as people age, the ability to continue to be out and about and to function within society. Equity, of course, is the leveling of the playing field for all of us. It's a thing that pulls us all together, that allows us to have conversations with one another. And hopefully post-COVID, very soon, we will be able to have these conversations again in person. Safety, we're going to come back to in just a few minutes. But I have never met anyone in intelligent transportation or in transportation who doesn't really put safety first. Because safety is about making sure that this data that comes from the connectivity, that comes from the autonomy, allows us to more safely move our vehicles down the road, to more safely interact between the vehicle and the pedestrian on the road, and of course those last mile options, things like the lifts and the birds and those types of scooters that allow us to move around in the last mile, to have those things operate in an interconnected fashion safely. And finally, sustainability. One of the things that has been interesting in the age of Ubers and Lyfts was that the original concept was that the Ubers and the Lyfts would pull some of these vehicles that we had, our own personal vehicles, would pull them off of the road. When in fact, what happened was people stayed in their own cars, they were driving their own cars, yet they were also using Ubers and Lyfts, and it was pushing more cars out. So one of the things that people are doing now in intelligent transportation and mobility is figuring out how we can move sustainability, determine when people actually want to keep their personal vehicles and when they want shared mobility. And of course, we could talk all day about now what does shared mobility mean in the age of COVID and in the age of post-COVID. That certainly is an issue that needs to be looked at and addressed. But right now, sustainability really means the ability to remove some of the vehicle traffic to where we have better air. It also means the utilization of more electric vehicles. And you will see, even in this COVID environment, where some of the manufacturing has been shut down, that in fact, sustainability has become and remains very important. So purpose plus people, that's intelligent transportation.
Yes, purpose plus people. And we keep mentioning this because it is so important. And as we see more connectivity and as we see more autonomous mobility, we also start to see smart cities rapidly increase. But to my point before, that is going to show a need for people that understand and embrace this new transportation, that also understand how to lead in this new world. And in order to do that, workforce needs to be educated and continue to skill their workers, to be certified and credentialed in things that maybe didn't necessarily exist before. So there's a lot of talk recently about cybersecurity and protection of the infrastructure. And this has been a concern for a very long time. But now the more that we know about how much connectivity we're going to have and how much we're going to be processing information, it becomes even more critical for every person in the organization to understand and cross-reference. So again, Regina's point, where they can talk to one another and make those decisions that really change the way that transportation is done. And so as the millennials and the generations that are here today are really fortunate to be able to see all of these new technologies come to fruition. I remember, as I said, decades ago, just getting a taste of how powerful technology was. We have more processing power in a smartphone than we had in a huge computer back then. And no one could have imagined that this new world was going to be here. And one thing that we're very committed to is that we know if we grow the person, we're going to grow the industry. And so if there's one thing that I could challenge each of you that are watching today to do, is to become that agent of change. Because if you're listening to my voice right now, there is opportunity for you to be that agent of change. So as an example, I'm going to play a video of one of our subject matter experts. Allison Malik, she's a millennial and an entrepreneur. And she was the founder of an autonomous vehicle company. And now she is the CEO of a company called Middle Third. But don't take my word for it. Let's listen to Allison.
I think for the millennial and Gen Z generations, talking about why, not just the technology and that the technology is cool, but talking about what it can do for people is really powerful. For people entering the industry, be it transportation, automotive, connectivity, focusing on projects where the outcome isn't really known yet, the technology doesn't have a full set of specs, it's going to be the hardest challenges that you would be diving into. But if you dive into those challenges early in your career in this industry, you're going to learn so much more and be so much further ahead of your peers because you've had to learn the how and the why of an industry that hasn't had to change in the last 50 to 100 years. One of the things that I really want to learn is how we can continue to change people's habits and thinking about transportation as a system, because I do truly believe that we can be achieving better outcomes with all of the money that we're spending on roads and cars and bridges and trains. I know we can be doing it better, and I want to figure out how to impact more people to get more people bought into a new vision of how we move.
Allison really is amazing. I mean, she has done some incredible things, including venture capital. She worked on the GM Volt electric vehicle design, and also the actual release. And so she comes to you from the millennial perspective of purpose and of mission and of empathy. Going back though to these four fundamental foundational elements, we wanted to we talked a little bit about some of them, but we wanted to give you an idea of some of the things that are truly at the top of the agenda right now. Autonomous, many of you remember, if you didn't grow up with, you may remember the Jetsons, where you were in a car that drove itself. That's autonomous movement. That's autonomous vehicles, whether it be a surface vehicle, a car, or whether it be a drone or a flying car. That's autonomy. Many people want to know, is it real? And we can talk about that later. Yeah, in fact, it is. Different stages of it. But one of the things that we found out, and we've been talking a little bit about COVID, and we have to, because this is the time that this world is living in, is that autonomy now is probably going to be more important than it even was before COVID, in that what folks have figured out is that in an effort to protect people, autonomous technology can be used to help move not just people, but goods. And we've seen across the country where different health providers have been using autonomous vehicles to actually move COVID blood tests and other PPE that's needed for our healthcare workers. So one of the things that people really are forecasting to come out of COVID is an increased desire for no more autonomous vehicles. Connected vehicles, we talked about connected vehicles. I can talk vehicle to vehicle. So a vehicle can talk to a vehicle can talk to a pedestrian can talk to a vehicle can talk to the infrastructure. So for example, the road can tell the vehicle, I think I'm starting to freeze up, it's getting cold. Or it can talk vehicle to vehicle. In other words, the car in front of you says, oh, I see an accident that's getting ready to happen up here, so I'm going to slow down because the cars up there are slowing down, so I'm going to tell you that we all need to slow down. So the connectivity between vehicles and infrastructure, and vehicles and individuals is absolutely important with promoting safety. Emergency preparedness, most of us have thought about emergency preparedness being simply there's a hurricane, there's a tornado, there's a flood, there's a drought, some sort of natural disaster. And many people are calling COVID a natural disaster. But one of the things that we have found out is that transportation has been critical. The logistical elements of transportation have been critical. We also learned that the patchwork of regulations that have happened state to state and region to region with regard to how different states and territories and regions are dealing with COVID has resulted in logistical nightmares. So, for example, one of the things that the Idaho DOT has done is put together a new system so where logistic managers for transportation can say, I need to move goods from Los Angeles to Jacksonville, Florida. What is my best route in getting there? What do I have to take into consideration in moving that freight? Well, I have to understand, are masks required in states? Are there restaurants open for the drivers? Is there a place for the driver to sleep? So in other words, many of the rest areas, especially when COVID started, were actually closed and there was no place for the drivers to go. How is it that I have to deal with weather challenges? And if I get stuck in weather challenges, what happens with regard to any quarantine measures that might be in effect state to state? You can go on and on and on and on with regard to the different elements that transportation has had to deal with in COVID. And then add on top of that, the fact that we had our box, what I call our box drivers, our UPS drivers, our FedEx drivers, the Amazons of the world that were continuing to try to get us the product and the goods and services that we needed, but yet they were themselves having to become frontline workers. So emergency preparedness, transportation, and COVID, very important. Elaina spoke earlier about who's actually going to install this equipment and who's going to keep it running. It's much different to put up an analog light than it is to put up a digital light. It's much different to have to work on an autonomous vehicle than have to work on a vehicle like I drive, which was, I will go ahead and admit, which is like an early 2000 car and, doesn't work the same way that everything works within a car that is actually a computer with a lot of hardware and mostly software. So the installer and the technician elements of this are important. ITS and new mobility communications. This is where we talk about 5G. Elaina's going to talk about that in a minute. But for those of you who are in this industry, dedicated short-range communications are what we call DSRC. 5G, 4G, 3G, the redundancy that these different Wi-Fi networks can give us. And in addition to that, making sure that you actually have access. And the most important part is how do those communications protocols work to make sure that safety is driven? So because if you're going to be in an autonomous vehicle and the autonomous vehicle is making decisions, that's one thing based upon artificial learning. It's a whole nother thing if you're in a connected vehicle and the connectivity is running over a Wi-Fi system and your Wi-Fi or 5G system has to be able to communicate. So very important. We talked about the importance of policy. Policy drives a lot of this. How do lawmakers see this? How does the public see this? How does the media see this? All important with regard to will new mobility and will intelligent transportation be accepted and how? And finally, smart cities and smart communities. How is it that I can be a smart city, but my neighboring city cannot? How is it that you have one set of rules in one community with regard to intelligent transportation and the actual interconnectivity between education and healthcare services and transportation and entertainment services in one community, but you don't have it in another community? And so we kind of look at this as not just a smart city as a subset of itself, but a smart community and how it actually affects an entire region. So these are really important areas with regard to infrastructure development when it comes to intelligent infrastructure, but it's also important when it comes to the new mobility systems. And if you're just coming out of school and you've been a part of this system, it's one thing. But if you've been working in DOTs for a long time and you're a traditional engineer or a traditional road planner, it's another thing. So take a listen to how Mark Shaput, who's the CEO of the American Center of Mobility, thinks about this particular question.
From the infrastructure owner's perspective, they need to understand their responsibilities in building and operating a safe system and how they need to coordinate with the vehicles and the technologies the vehicles are deploying to really work together. In the past, the road builders built the roads, the automobile manufacturers built the automobiles, and they really didn't coordinate together. So now all the different industries are working together to advance these transformational technologies of connected and automated and mobility technology. It's really a continuous learning challenge. Again, there's a lot of new technologies out there, new technologies that have never been leveraged into transportation before. So understanding and learning how they function, how they can be leveraged, and then effectively deploying them into operational applications is really a challenge. And you're not going to be able to do it with your traditional civil engineering degrees and everything you've learned about building roads and bridges. So you really got to branch out and understand all these different technologies.
And that's a really important thing to understand. Here in the Detroit area, we have a facility called ACM, which is the American Center for Mobility. And that was Mark, who is the acting COO currently, and they do a lot around communication. They also do a lot around testing. So when we talk about ITS-based communications, we talk about how do they communicate. Regina mentioned earlier the technology is called DSRC, which is Dedicated Short-Range Communication. This is one way that vehicles can talk to infrastructure over very short waves. So hence its name, Dedicated Short-Range Communication. There's a ton of stuff that you can learn about that, and a lot of things you can read about some of the spectrum and how that is allocated for safety. But there's also these new technologies that many of you probably turn on your TV now and you see 5G, 5G. 5G is a new technology. It's not like the past evolution of technology and cellular. A lot of people think it's, just like 1G, 2G, 3G. It's really not. It's a new technology altogether. And so when we start thinking about all of the information that's going to be communicated from vehicles to infrastructure, from vehicles to vehicles, from pedestrians to vehicles. So think about being on a bicycle and you have a smart community or a smart city, and you have the ability to have a vehicle alert you that it's coming over the hill or that it's going too fast to stop at the stop sign. The way that can be communicated is through unique communication protocols that must be implemented. So again, now that we're talking about the workforce, we're talking about people are needed to understand all of these new communication tools, all of the inner workings of how the vehicles will communicate. What does the cybersecurity look around those communication tools? And to talk a little bit more about that is Anthony, who is another one of our subject matter experts, and he specializes in 5G.
The use cases that are going to be capable with 5G far outweigh what the current technology is able to maintain. So if we had this large pipeline of data volume that we know is going to be eventually coming in through cameras, sensors, IoT, whatever it may be, the only way that we're going to be able to integrate all of it together is through a massive amount of connectivity space. 5G enables a lot of that. Technology has advanced us so far as a society that if you're not constantly updating what your capabilities are technologically, you're going to be left behind. It's important for everybody to understand exactly where this is today and where it can bring us in the future.
Technology difficulty.
Technology. Well, it's really interesting. You see the lag. So, yeah. And we are meant to deal with that when we're dealing on these shared systems with regard to presentations. But that slight lag is a really good example of what can't happen in connectivity. In other words, when you're talking about safety and when you're talking about the importance of connected vehicles, you want to make sure that the technology that you're doing allows that split-second, redundant, automatic connectivity. Is it 5G? Is it DSRC? For those of you who want to enter this field, or for those of you who are already in this field, you will either quickly learn or you already know that that is the actual argument. It's a policy argument, it's a technology argument, it's a safety argument. It is about the ability for things to connect and promote safety. If you take a look at these statistics, so there's a group called the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration. It's part of DOT. It's called NHTSA. They report numbers of people who die in auto crashes in the United States every year. And one of the good things about these figures that you see in 17, 18, and 19 is that the figures are going down. Some of this is due to more connectivity and better the ability for the connectivity to work in certain areas. Some of it has to do with seatbelt usage. Some of it has to do with the fact that there's been a large don't text and drive campaign. There's a large don't drink and drive campaign that have been going on for years. But the most important thing for intelligent transportation is that these systems be put into place to make sure that those 36,000 people who lost their lives on the American roadways yesterday aren't just accepted. You know, prior to COVID, we would say, and you would hear intelligent transportation folks say, it's a horrible thing when we lose 200 or 300 people in a plane crash. And if you lose a couple of those, the world goes on fire, policymakers jump into gear, and we immediately focus on what's the problem. But for some reason, society has decided to
Regina? I believe we may be having a little technical difficulty.
Yeah, I'm sending her a message. Just stand by.
Sure. Well, as Regina is frozen, I can certainly talk to the fact that she is correct in that it's a tragedy to lose so many lives. And so what being part of this new industry is, it's about having new opportunities in new fields to be able to save those lives. And so I'm going to let one of our subject matter experts tell his story.
Camera, what color should be? Good.
Yes, we pressed everybody.
I was in a car that was approaching another car. The two cars were talking electronically, and the driver kept his foot on the pedal. So we're moving along, and the two cars talked to each other, understood there was going to be a crash. And the car I was in, with the driver keeping his foot on the gas, came to a complete stop about 1.5 yards away from the car, all done electronically with vehicle-to-vehicle communication. So that was the first time that I thought, this is a game changer. I was involved in the early activity with Delphi as they worked on their vehicle-to-vehicle communication, and now with Morelli doing similar work in new technology with vehicle-to-vehicle communication. People that are driving have a tendency to lose focus and are responsible for 80 to 90% of the accidents. So if you look back in history, the first year that we hit the fatal rate of 100 accidents per day was back in 1937. So pretty much all of us have grown up in an era when there's been a lot of accidents. It's kind of a normal thing. And sometimes I think we just don't stop and say, with all our technology now, why can't we fix this? We know what the problem is. We know the driver's the problem. So how do you fix the driver? You're probably not going to change him. So you have to find ways to augment the driver or take some responsibility away from the driver, which is what they do with the aircraft industry. They have transponders that talk to each other and mitigate accidents in the air. The same technology will be used to mitigate accidents in cars. Most new vehicles today are connected. A good example of that is the GM OnStar system, which has been around for quite a while. That makes the car connected. It means that the car can connect electronically to somewhere else and do a lot of pretty cool things for the car. The autonomous vehicle can be a connected vehicle also. In fact, we think most all autonomous vehicles will be connected, but a connected vehicle is not necessarily autonomous, but an autonomous vehicle is almost always going to be connected. With the connected vehicles, there are some technologies coming along that's going to make them a little bit different. And one of the things is the new standard for defining the communication protocol for 5G that's going to come out in a few years. The new protocol will allow a mobile phone to talk from one mobile phone directly to another mobile phone without going through a tower. So this would allow two vehicles driving along a remote road to communicate with each other and not have to have a tower present. But anytime you have vehicles that can communicate with each other and exchange information, it can be a benefit to the driver. Connected vehicle technology has the potential to save so many lives, and it's going to take a while to implement it. So I probably won't get any benefit from it. Maybe my kids, maybe my grandkids, more likely my grandkids. So if I can make the world a better place for my grandkids and maybe reduce the possibility that they would be in an accident, that would be the best.
Well, Gina, we're glad to have you back.
Thanks. Yeah, I don't know. All I want to say is that is an example of what we don't want in interconnectivity when it comes to connected vehicles. Yeah, sorry about that. But yeah, what I think the thing that was important about what Gary has to say, and we just literally talked with him a couple of months ago about this, is that if you want to be the person that can actually make a big difference, that this is a field where you can make a big difference. It really doesn't matter if you have been in this field for a very long time, or if you're just thinking about where you're going to go to school or just getting out of school. There are so many different elements to intelligent transportation and new mobility that you too can help make the roadways a safer place.
That's right. And you know, we're running out of time. We want to leave some time for questions so that we can hear from you. If there's one thing that I hope that we've been able to show today is that this industry is where purpose meets people and where people really do make a difference. So when you're sitting there one evening or in the morning drinking coffee or some water, and you think, how could I really make a difference in the world? I want you to remember that there is an industry that needs change. And there is an industry that needs people. And so the question that I would like to leave you with before we jump into the questions and answers for Regina and I are, how could you be that agent of change? So with that said, I'd like to open up to the moderator to see if Carol, would you like to have some questions for us?
It does look like maybe one scrolling at the bottom. I'll ask you, Elaina.
Oh, there you go.
Okay, you said this generation will be the first that really gets to see these technologies in place. So for connected vehicles or autonomous vehicles, how real are they?
Oh, they're very real, Regina. You know, I get this question a lot because in different areas of the world, you will see a greater consistency of them and you'll see them being implemented in different ways. So because it is very different around the policy side, whether you're in different countries or whether you're even in different states here in the United States, you have different ways that you can use these technologies, but they are very real. So if you look at the autonomous vehicle, there's autonomous vehicles that you see today. We have a company called May Mobility that has a self-driving shuttle to take people from one place to another. You have several universities across the nation that are implementing self-driving vehicles across campus so that students can get to their classes easier. We have self-driving technologies that we can see in California and in Rhode Island, where you can also have autonomous vehicles that are delivering services or food. And so to your point earlier, when we think about this worldwide issue that we're having in this terrible pandemic, some of these technologies can have those last mile implications where you could have touchless delivery. Perhaps you could have drones, which even though a drone is a flying vehicle, a lot of people don't realize that autonomy is around self-driving and the different levels. So whether it's operated by a person is a level 1, or if it's operated by no one at all would be a higher level, a level 4 technology. But whether it's in the air or whether it's on the ground, these technologies exist.
Yeah, I have a lot of folks ask me here in Washington, when are we going to be able to see true autonomous cars for individuals? And if you take that out of the Washington, D.C. or out of the policymaker area and you move it into the area of technology, what most technologists I think will tell you is that there is some level of technology. So there are like 5 levels of technology of autonomous technology, without getting too technical. And level 3, out of the 5, there are some level 3 vehicles out on the road. So things like if you have a car that can park itself, that is a form of autonomy. If you have a car that will, if you're driving down the road and you can that car keeps itself in a lane. So for example, you want to change lanes, but it sees that there may be another vehicle coming up too fast behind you or beside you, it will keep you from changing lanes. It's called lane keep. That's a form of autonomy. So some of it's still out there, but I don't know, Elaina, you're better at this than I am, but I'm thinking it's probably going to be a few years before we see autonomous cars really driving down the street with everybody else watching a movie in the car. Right?
Well, I have to concur with you, Regina. The things that I really like to let people realize or really talk about is connectivity exists right now. So from 2012 beyond, if you drive, although thank you for sharing with everyone that your car is not connected, but if you drive if you drive a connected vehicle, there are connectivity that you can have today. And we will see connectivity become more and more useful, and more people will demand it because it is safer. You mentioned the ADAS systems. The ADAS systems are advanced driver safety systems. So if you are in the lane keep, as you mentioned, it will allow you to avoid moving over into the wrong lane. So these technologies are utilized today. It will be a few years, I must say, just like we all know, before we won't see any driving. And I do have a lot of people that say to me, well, I don't ever want to not drive. But as the future progresses, we will see this unfold, and the technologies are only moving toward having the ability to do so. Is there another question?
Here's another one. The need for this learning seems to be extensive. Can you give us some real life examples of upskilling that is needed? I know you've got a lot of examples on this one, but I want to tell you one.
Sure.
I was here in Washington at a conference in January, and a gentleman stood up because we were talking about the development of workers, upskilling of workers, what Department of Transportation folks actually need with regard to understanding the technologies that comes into place, either for planning purposes or for just day to day. And he stood up and he said what state he was from. And he said, I have worked for DOT, my DOT now, which was a state DOT, a Department of Transportation, for about 15 years. And I was the guy that when we all went to a computerized system who actually networked the computers together. So I'm now in charge of connected vehicles. And I don't even know what that means. And so what you see are examples of, in particular, public agencies who are struggling to take the workforce that they have and make sure that they have access to the ability to learn, because they do, but the ability to learn what these new technologies mean and who needs to be in charge of these different areas. So it is real. Day to day, folks are struggling to make sure, as we said at the beginning, that it's not just about the new technology and what you buy, but that you're not buying the Betamax, and that when you do buy it and that you do put it into place, that it actually works. I know you have other examples.
Well, what I'd really like to share is this is actually good news. This is really good news that we are able to upskill. It would be incredibly frustrating if we had to start from ground zero and we had no knowledge whatsoever to be able to build upon. But to your point, and to the people that are out there actively looking for programs, in the last 5 years, we've really seen an uptick in universities and community colleges that are offering baseline classes. We have seen in the last 2 years a lot of certifications that can be had, or that can be applied to additional learning. So if you already have, let's say, an engineering degree, or you already have some credits at a college, how can you get those credentials and you can stack them in order to be able to have a better understanding of a skill set? So we're not talking about, oh, I'm going to have to go 10 years in order to be able to achieve this. We're talking about taking you where you are today and then assessing where it is you want to be. Because I think we've shown there are so many options that if you align your skills, and then on top of that, you receive the education, now competency-based education. So make sure that it's a good program with solid learning objectives and that your competencies are going to take you where you need to be. You can upskill and reskill your staff in a reasonable amount of time and get a lot more effort out of your team because, one, you're investing in them or you're investing in yourself. So you'll get a lot more knowledge from being able to understand all of these concepts because there is a lot to learn.
And isn't part of the education, we touched on it earlier, but isn't part of the education not only this venue or verticals, telecommunications, transportation, et cetera, but also within DOTs themselves, so to where folks do understand what the others are talking about, but also then between the private sector and the public sector.
Yes, that is a tremendous issue. And it's something that, again, we really want to help we teach both on the vehicle side as well as on the transportation side. Because if you imagine you have a transportation engineer or a transportation planner of a city, and then we're going to begin in the very near future when we see 5G, we are going to begin to see more and more data. We're going to get more and more data that comes from the vehicle and to the infrastructure. We have to have the ability for them to talk to one another so that we can support the new vehicles that are coming out that are connected, and that we can support being able to have that information for us to make better decisions. So I don't want to discount how important being able to communicate between these industries are. And that's why we're not only talking about technical skills, while we're talking about knowledge transfer for leaders as well. So your leaders, your policymakers, your technicians, your maintenance, your installers, your engineers. There's so much that can be done in this industry. And there are things out there now to help.
Well, and I would just add to that too, you mentioned policymakers, is that this is a very regulated industry. I mean, if you just took the auto side of it, everybody knows how regulated the auto side is. And then you look at the true transportation elements, the surface transportation, air transportation, everything is very regulated. But I think that one of the things that's really important that I think we have to address is how the public sees this. So in other words, if the public is not accepting of technology, policymakers won't be accepting of it, media won't be accepting of it. So it almost is one of those things where you have to, in many instances, step back and say, well, what is intelligent transportation, like we were trying to do here today? Make sure that policymakers understand, but then go out to the public and make sure that the public understands. Because again, if you go to the purpose and marrying the purpose and people of intelligent transportation, technology can be scary. I know a lot of folks have told me that one of the things that they remember in studying about new technologies is that when elevators first came into use, that it was almost 15 or 20 years before folks were able to actually use an elevator without an elevator person in there. Even though the elevator technology didn't need an elevator operator, people didn't trust the technology. They didn't want to get in that box and move up and down. So I think it's incumbent upon all of us who are interested in this particular field to make sure that the public's questions get answered and that they are comfortable with the technology as well.
I agree.
Okay, ladies, we have one more question that came in.
Last question. How do you think the number of deaths will change in 2020 since the pandemic? With so many staying at home over so many weeks? Well, I can take a first shot at that. The numbers will probably go down. The numbers will go down, which is a good thing. But that will be driven purely by the fact that there will be less people on the road. One of the things that I have noticed, and then I'll switch it over to Elaina because I know we're short of time, is that the DOTs, both the local, county, state DOTs, and the federal DOT has used this time to be able to develop some protocols for these types of natural disasters, to where when people do come back out, that they're going to have protocols in place. Because one of the things that's going to happen is these shared mobilities. People are not going to want to get in transit. They're not going to want to get on a bus. They're not going to want to get on metros and subways. And so there's going to be more traffic on the road.
That's true. And in the interest of time, because I think we have just a few minutes left, I would say the same. Because of how we have been inside for weeks, clearly there was not as much traffic. And there's way more of a cascading effect that had on our transportation system than we have time to address here. But because there was not as many people on the roads, clearly there would be less people that would have the traffic accidents if there's no one driving at that moment. So when we've really taken a look at how COVID impacted transportation, all the way from a financial perspective, all the way into, as Regina said, emergency response and the policy side. So we're going to really know more in the upcoming months. But what I can say for certain is that we are better equipped today to understand more of how we can be a safer, have a safer driving experience, independent of the pandemic, but how with technology and people that we can make a difference. So I believe
so join us.
Time for exactly. So join us today.
Thank you, ladies. That was very informative. Really enjoyed it. So Elaina and Regina, thank you. And thank you to all our Campus Party digital edition sponsors. Really enjoyed you being here today.
Thank you.
Thank
Stay
you.
safe, everybody.